Bom, gente, a gente vai. Essa é a nossa última sessão do dia de hoje. Para quem estava na conferência, na abertura, desde o primeiro dia, eu acho que eu expliquei, contei um pouquinho de o lugar da professora Lin assume na história desse seminário, na história da nossa rede de pesquisas, na história do nosso grupo. E agora, então, o meu papel só é apresentá-los, a professora Lina Some formalmente. A professora Lina Some é a presidente do Conselho para o Desenvolvimento das Ciências Sociais na África, que tem sede em Dakar, mas ela é diretora e professora no Instituto Maquineiro de Pesquisa Social em Kampala, Uganda. São dois centros, centro de Kampala, isso em inglês, é um dos centros mais importantes de produção de conhecimento das ciências sociais hoje, no continente africano. Eu queria agradecer a professora Lene e passar a palavra para ela nessa tarde, e a gente vai ter os comentários e instruções da professora Jenny Jones, depois da fala da professora Lene. Thank you very much, and welcome to you. No, actually.
Very well. Yeah.
There it goes. Yes.
Okay.
Otherwise, the translators they can get it.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. It's not easy to sit here at 5 p.m. So what I want to talk about, women, gender data. The title of what I want to talk about is, I want to think about the relationship between social reproduction, or what sometimes we call care labor, although I think care is a subset of the broader process of social reproduction, and the surplus populations in the global south, or what I like to call the agrarian south. And I want to think about this relationship through three broad claims, three broad interventions. First, the first sort of claim relates to the question regarding, I think this thing we're all asking ourselves, what is happening to those who capital no longer needs, those who capital no longer requires, and which capital is expanding or expelling in very large numbers from industry, even from agriculture, from manufacturing. What is happening to these people? How do we understand the conditions of survival and sustenance of immiserated populations for whom wages and state support are inadequate and or not present? Those who are not getting any wages and those who are not getting any form of support from the state. The second problem relates to the reproduction of care. This need for care, even in the absence, we still need to care for people, whether we are earning money or whether they're making money or not. But even in the absence of state support and wages, most governments or any state has to be able to guarantee some kind of care in order to cover, right? So there's a contextual question. So in other words, the survival of even of the most immiserated population constitutes the very basis of political legitimacy for even the most neoliberal governments. So we saw this during COVID. Of course, Brazil has a very extended program to the Bolsa Família. We saw in South Africa. So even the most neoliberal states have to kind of guarantee some amount of care or have to provide some kind of support in order to come. And third, where the state and the market abdicate or surrender their social reproductive responsibility, in the global south, in the agrarian south, common lands, the commons, and nature constitute the very basis of survival for agrarian populations. This is something we've been hearing during the last 2.5 days. And the point I'm trying to make here is that even though many data from a lot of countries are telling us that the contribution that agriculture is making to GDP is so much less now. This is something we can't argue with. It doesn't mean land has not been developed, right? So we still have to, we are still engaged in the struggles for land. We still have to fight for agrarian reforms or agrarian transformation. So land remains relevant precisely because in the agrarian south, land remains a very important basis for the survival of many populations. So in the third world, the conversion of landed resources, and if I talk of landed resources, I mean food, nature, water, energy, to use and exchange value. This is the important point. This conversion from into use value into a form that people can use on a daily basis cannot be thought of outside of the gendered labor relations or women's labor that guarantee, and this, I talk of gendered labor a lot because this is labor that is performed mainly but not exclusively by women. Men also perform this work. Children also perform this work. All sorts of people perform this work, but it is mainly performed by women. And so this fact reconstitutes gendered labor itself as an agrarian question. What we thought of in other organizations as the agrarian question of gender labor. In both its social, this agrarian question of gender labor has social dimensions, has political dimensions. And I will try to elaborate what I mean. But first, a brief introduction to the concept of surplus populations, because it's a key conceptual category thinking about. And I know it's familiar to many of us, so bear with me. But the notion of, this notion of the surplus population has a long historical lineage in the political economy literature. And the core of this argument is at the core of the notion of surplus populations is an argument regarding the value of labor under capitalism, in direct relation to the cost and the necessity of reproducing capitalism for the purpose of accumulation. And so the idea of necessity is central to this formulation. On the one hand, the necessity for the survival that drives what people need, that what people have to go into work, that drives working people to accept low exploitative wages, and on the other hand, the calculation by capitalists to retain wages and to retain wage workers at very low wages, even when there is technological advancements and mechanization. So at the margins of this requirement for labor that is cheap, capital is always demanding labor that is cheap, labor that is exploitable, and through which capital is able to ensure its expansion, we have an ever-growing surplus population that emerges, that is easily accessible because its labor cost is cheap. And this is a Marxist kind of reserve army argument. And so you can't actually understand the wage worker and this surplus population separately. So Marx's argument really was that the proletarian, the worker, is always somehow already excess to the needs of capital. You are taken in when you need, when the capital needs you. When you are not needed, you are pushed out. So Marx was talking of these different forms of surplus of reserve labor, whether it is stagnant or floating or latent. And Marx was thinking that these wage workers are producing commodities for exchange, but at the same time they are producing their own non-need, right? But beyond this Marxian argument of the reserve army, beyond this argument that this reserve army is integral to the labor force and social structure of capital. Of central concern to us, I think a question that should really concern us should be the question regarding what is happening to the millions that capital no longer needs, right? In the absence of wages, someone else has to take up the burden of their reproduction, right? Again, as I said on the first day, the fact that, we know millions of people, even here in Brazil, where I come from, millions of people who are being pushed out every day. The fact that we are not stepping over dead bodies every day means that someone is carrying that burden, right? And we have to be concerned with that, what Marx himself called with this hidden gold, against theorizing in a kind of feminist sense. So someone has to take up the burden of their reproduction, and this undertaking has certain social and political implications. So in a material sense, the processes of social reproduction that guarantee to capital a steady flow of labor and usually undertaken by a gendered workforce, a feminist workforce, and this is the paradox or the tension. This gendered and feminist workforce also constitutes the surplus population, right? It is both part of the surplus and it is engaged in reproducing the surplus. So therefore, this tension puts into question the very idea of a surplus population. Can we really talk about a surplus population when, if we take seriously this gendered labor component, right? And furthermore, because reproduction takes place whether or not people are employed, the imperative to let live, this kind of biopolitics, something is sort of, the imperative to let live that haunts the survival, and as I said earlier, even the most neoliberal states have, in order to retain some political legitimacy, have to take care of these people who are working in some small way. So this is the imperative to let live that haunts the survival of surplus populations cannot be grasped on the basis of the economic dimension alone. So what I'm critiquing here is the economism that drives a lot of the literature around surplus population and the labor reserve. So I think we also have to be thinking of the social spheres, the social dimension. There's a social dimension around the reproduction of this population, and there is a political dimension that govern the livelihoods and the struggles of working people. And again, this is what I've been hearing, again, especially in the session just before this one, and the other sessions around this. There's a political claim, but we are neoliberalism and capitalism is such that if you can't show us the surplus value and how, because this has been the argument against feminists, the moment we talk about social reproduction, we all want to theorize it around showing that this labor, gendered labor, produces surplus value for capitalism. But actually, our arguments, especially when you look at the third world, a lot of this labor is simply for survival. People need to survive, and we have to move away from always looking, because I think we miss something about the dimensions of the social struggles in the third world. If you're constantly thinking about the value relation, this wage-capital relation. So the argument I'm making here is fundamentally a political. And that argument is that the focus on economic relations, the economic relations alone conceals the fundamental question which the surplus population poses in this present time. Regarding the structure of gender labor that guarantees its survival in the absence of state support and in the absence of market support, in the absence of wages. And furthermore, a concrete understanding of the surplus population of today cannot be divorced from the colonial condition of massive dispossession, of subjugation, of immiseration, which was ushered in by capitalist exploitation and uneven development of the territories. And then in here we can think of Fanon, right? Fanon's insight that capitalism's, and I'm quoting Fanon here, capitalism's abandonment can either keep the surplus laborer in his place, or with a different consciousness, Rosa in her talk was talking today about awakening, right? Rather than learning, you talked about awakening. So Fanon is saying that the abandonment of capitalism can either keep the surplus laborer in his place, or with a different consciousness, place him in a position to choose action, which is directed towards the social structures and subjugate them. And this action announces the incipient class struggle that is characteristic of the dispossessed. It announces rebellion, right? Where there is this massive dispossession, it is not surprising. Rebellion is just the other side of it. It announces rebellion, that political response to social impossibility. And this is quintessentially the response of the regime, right? So the social conditions under which social reproduction and its gender labor component mediate the space between social dispossession and political stability or instability. On the one hand, we have a mass of dispossessed people, dispossessed of land, dispossessed of jobs, dispossessed of housing. On the other side, we have a state or whatever structure is governing a place that is constantly seeking some form of stability, which is also instability, right? The state is always fighting against its own annihilation. In between these two struggles is a gendered labor, a structure of gendered labor, what I like to think of now as a substratum. If you think of this floor, under this floor, there is a structure that is keeping everything held and stable. It looks stable, but we have to pay attention to that structure because it's not a normal structure. It is a structure with agency. It is a structure that is completely being depressed, that is going to implode one day. And if that implodes as COVID showed us, we struggle. So how might we understand the historical conditions of, now I'm going to talk about on Africa. How do we understand the historical conditions of surplus labor in Africa? We can think of this also probably in relation to the third world. So this is still kind of trying to make sense conceptually of the different dimensions of this surplus and how we think of gender labor or social reproduction in relation to it. So the Africa's surplus population has long been theorized in relation to the history of colonization as a reserve, as a labor reserve, right? So if you think of Samir Amin, Samir Amin's typology, Samir Amin thought of Africa as three wide micro-regions, right? He thought of, and he was basing his typology on the similarities in the model of colonial exploitation and in the similarities in relation to the forms of dependence. So he talked of an Africa of colonial trade economy. He talked of an Africa of the concession-owning companies, West Africa, and so on. And he talked of the Africa of the labor reserves, the settler colonies, right? And each of these were organized very much around producing for the mother country, producing for the reputable countries, while providing very low and stagnating wages to the local labor. And of course, this was coerced labor under colonialism. So labor reserves were specifically developed on the basis of the policy of colonial imperialism, according to the principle of enclosure acts. Capital at the center needed to have a large proletariat immediately available because there was great need for wealth to exploit, gold, diamonds in South Africa, copper in northern Rhodesia, and an untypical settler agriculture in countries like Kenya, southern Rhodesia, what is now Zimbabwe, right? And Germany and Canada. And the colonizers obtained this proletariat quickly by dispossessing, again, this dispossessing rural communities, sometimes by violence, and driving them deliberately back into small, poor regions with no means of modifying, or with no means of modernizing and intensifying their farming. So in this way, they forced the traditional societies to be suppliers of the temporary labor, and they produced permanent migrants on a very large scale, and therefore providing cheap labor for the European mines and farms and later to manufacturing. So recognizing their significance in the social stabilization, this migrant labor was very important in stabilizing the colonies, right? And it was this migrant labor regime externalized to the reserves, political costs that were associated with a large, stable black population under a white supremacist rule. In other words, the primary question that colonialism posed, primary political question that colonialism posed to the colonies was the native question. How do you stabilize a colony with a majority native population? How does a small white minority stabilize its rule over a majority native population, right? Predominantly, we've understood this in a political way through indirect political rule, the creation of Bantustans and traditional authorities, right? This is on Danny's arguments and others. It's a correct assessment of the political method of political stabilization. What they don't talk about is that the condition of the possibility for the stabilization of the colonies around this rural urban, this bifurcated rule depended very much on the kind of reproductive labor that was presumed to take place in the rural areas, in the reserves, right, in the native reserves, where we had the pass laws everywhere. You would stay there, and the heads of families or the men could come. I mean, primitive accumulation itself is stabilized by an assumption of a domain of genders in reproductive labor that is rural labor, right? So even within the colonies, the reproduction of workers is externalized to the households. Locally, it is externalized to the peripheries. So imperialism itself was externalizing this social reproductive process in the peripheries. This is a process that is still ongoing. In fact, under the current conditions of imperialism, we are seeing this cost of social reproduction being externalized to a very great extent to the peripheries. And so contemporary theorizations of surplus labor related to the current phase of globalization, right? Much of the literature is talking about what globalization is doing. And some of these features are said to be different from earlier phases of globalization. And the emphasis is placed on a non-productive form of the current phase, this current phase of financialized capitalism, which is characterized really by a hindrance to the, financialized capitalism is not producing jobs, right? We are not seeing an expansion of the productive systems. We are seeing a growing financialization of accumulation, right? The problem is that financial expansion is not being accompanied by prosperity in the real economy, right? No jobs. It feeds, and this I'm citing JAR and Geros here, it feeds not a healthy real economy, but a stagnant economy. And this financialization of accumulation bears multiple implications, including that in its pursuit for immediate speculative gains, it is contributing to an effective squeeze on capital in production. And therefore, it's seriously undermining economic policy space, particularly for global South states. It compresses investments and so on. But while the effect of this squeeze on employment is not confined to the global South, it's also happening in the global North. Financial extractivism is a global phenomenon. I think we can still differentiate the surplus populations that are emerging in the global South, in the third world, from those that are emerging in the advanced capitalist countries. And again, here I'm thinking of, Kapusa and Tawan Patnaik have tried to make this distinction. How we think of the surplus population in the north and in the global south, those found in the peripheries, and they try to show a qualitative difference in these two, what they call reserve funds. In their formulation, it is the surplus population located within the metropolis that can strictly be called a reserve fund, while the one located in the periphery is not so much a reserve army as simply a massive labor reserve. This is a point I was making in the first day. The importance of this distinction, again, in the Marxian literature, this reserve army has been thought of as, I think, the most important role, economic role that we're given is that we are able to discipline long, right? Take the low wages you're giving, otherwise we bring other people in, right? You're always expendable. So while this reserve army, this massive labor reserve, which is to be found in the global south, Mabad and Musa Parnaik are saying their disciplining role for workers employed by capital in the metropolis is at best imperfect, right? It can't even play that role. Again, this goes back to the point about how expendable this population is. So again, it's the point I don't want you to use is the labor that is keeping. It's not just the labor, but the imperatives. When we talk of survival, when we fight for territories, it's not just that we are resisting capital. There's another force that is trying to, there's a huge population that is not supposed to be alive, but is being kept alive through these struggles. And these people have to remain, these populations have to remain central in our imagination, in our struggles. So if the presumption of surplus peoples as consumers and as constantly threatening to replace an undisciplined labor force does not hold true for the third world labor reserves, the implication is a population that is fundamentally rendered as an undesired excess. Right? You don't even see what you're useful for anymore. You're not even talking about discipline wage workers. So it's rendered as fundamentally as an undesired excess to the needs of capital, such that its survival becomes irrelevant to capital or to its functioning. The fact, however, that capital no longer needs this labor does not diminish the fact that these populations still need to survive, or they still need to be kept alive. And as such, the economies of socially reproducing them in the absence of adequate wages and state support emerges as one of the most fundamental social problems being produced by capitalist development in the global south today. So the social reproduction literature, the traditional social reproduction literature, the global North social reproduction literature, or the one that we are drawing from, takes the dominant relationship of our time under capitalism is that of wage, labor, and capital, right? This is social reproduction intervenes into that relationship. And so the mainstream social reproduction literature takes this wage capital relation as the principal object of analysis and considers the institutions and the mechanisms and the processes which reproduce the ideological relationship that reproduces this relationship. How do we, capitalism itself depends on the reproduction of this relationship between itself and the So, but surplus populations of the third world define this formulation and compare a consideration of the full extent of the agrarian, informal and petty trade commodities that sustain workers in the absence of leaders. What I'm saying is, when you think of a population that has been removed from the wage labor equation, then we have to take seriously the other domains that sustain this population. Those other domains include land, the agrarian relations, they include informal work, they include petty commodity production, right? So thinking, again, this is, I think, something, a methodological thing about thinking from our vantage point, right? This is the decolonial question for us. We might use some of these theories as an anchor, but how do we think of them? How are they modified when we take seriously the actually existing conditions in our locations, right? So, in our own argument, in fact, has been to show the articulation between the realms of wages, petty production, and peasant agriculture. What we've been arguing in our theorizations, myself and my colleague, Sirisha and I, have been thinking about this, what we are thinking was an agrarian question of gender labor. And one of the things we are arguing is that actually, within much of the global south, there are very few households that can survive on wages alone. Most households are surviving on a combination of incomes. There will be someone who is a wage worker, there will be someone who is involved in petty trade, there is someone who is involved in the agriculture, the peasant peasant agriculture. So most households survive on this combination. So these three realms on their own are now on their own. Peasant agriculture on its own might not guarantee survival. Informal trade on its own might not guarantee survival, wages alone, but we need to think of them in combination. So the combination of these three also cannot be thought of, or you can't understand them adequately outside of the gendered labor, the regimes of gendered labor that on the one hand constitute labor power through social reproduction, the work that we do to feed workers every day so that they can go and work. And on the other hand, ensures the conversion of exchange value into use value. This articulation, forgive me if I'm to maybe in a discussion some of these things might be clearer. But this articulation raises a further question regarding what it means for reproductive laborers to be engaged in the reproduction of the surplus population. And this is the point I was making earlier. What is the implication of the conscription of gendered labor into the social reproduction of a surplus population to which it also belongs? Right? My last, I think the second last section. I'm almost done. Close. This, you know, I want to think about briefly about the political reproduction, because I keep talking about that the surplus population have to be understood in a political way, in a political relation. So the political reproduction of surplus people. And the fundamental argument here is that surplus populations pose a political question that is not readily apparent when we examine the working classes, which we tend to do through a very economic statement. So beyond the social constitutions, the social constitution of surplus people at the margins of the economy, these are people who are quite marginal to the economic production or development itself. I think what gives surplus populations their legibility is in relation to a primary problem imposed to the state. The surplus populations pose a problem to the state. Through the political question regarding what to do with a population which is both central to the political project of the post-colonial colonizing state, because this is the aim of the post-colonial. Any colonizing state is kind of, you imagine it sweeping with a broad brush, clearing the errors of the mistakes of the colonial regime, right? So the political question regarding what to do with the population that is both central to the political project of the post-colonial colonizing state, but marginal to its neoliberal capitalist accumulation logic, right? Again, it's the tension between the economic and the political. The state has to take this. We've been hearing all these conversations around the concessions. And it's not very fair to call it concessions. You know, they come out of struggles of indigenous population, the kilometers, and so on. That is the one side. The imperative of the democratizing state, the post-colonial democratizing state. On the other hand, these states remain neoliberal. These people are marginal to its accumulation. So the intervening process in these two poles is the necessity of social reproduction that under conditions of excess labor is undertaken on behalf of the state. So this social reproduction, these gender laborers are working not on behalf of capital. Capital doesn't care. Capital can actually just unfortunately keep more this mass of population near capitalism. So this social reproduction is actually being undertaken on behalf of the state, rather than on behalf of capital. This is a claim suggesting that the political project of stabilizing and legitimizing the post-colonial state amidst massive immiseration depends to a great extent on the survival of the surplus population, which is ensured through various processes of social reproduction. And these processes of social reproduction in the agrarian south, in the global south, in much of the third world, are dependent on some kind of access to land, whether it is private land or common land, and other informal economies. State grants, grant like what we've seen here and in South Africa, which in Africa is the most extensive social welfare regime, social welfare state. This is also central to political stabilization, and we have to be them as stabilizing mechanism, right? And so, to finish, the very last points I want to make, I'm going to skip through some of it. What is the nature of the reproductive crisis? What is the nature of the crisis in the global south then, to which we are responding to which feminists work theorizing gender, labor, and social reproduction respond. To reiterate again, in agrarian societies, the political nature of the surplus population is activated not merely by the claims they make in public, to which they access, and so in a sense do not matter, but more substantively by the demands they impose on the reproductive economies of Kenya, particularly gender and labor, and on the material domains of land, on the commons and petty economies, on which such reproduction depends. Again, is to emphasize that our struggles for land are really, it's a matter of survival. Because a lot of the literature that we draw on around care, around social reproduction, imagines a state that just does not exist in the it doesn't exist in the country. This state that will give us some welfare and will give us some when you're unemployment, that state doesn't exist. And so there is a kind of a political relationship that is established between the surplus populations and the state because of the demands that these populations are making. These populations are saying, we're not going to get land, or we're not going to split the state, right? Even if you're accessing the commons, you are not going to split the state. So the state has to remain an object of our struggles and our analysis. And it's definitely very central in our feminist political economy thinking on this question of gender labor. And the historical, colonial, social context matters, right? In other words, the surplus population only emerges historically. This is important. This population only emerges historically as a social problem when the political demands for survival and solidarity expressed and practiced by natives conflict with the capitalist logics of accumulation by dispossession, right? Or even elimination. If there was no tension, if there was enough land, if there was enough land for everyone to go through this tension, there won't be a political relation. Land would just be land and nature would just be nature and the commons would be assessing. In other words, under conditions where both the surplus populations and capital lay claim on the same resources for vastly different reasons, what is set up is a political relationship that is marked by first serious contestation, is marked by violence in the historical time, but even in the present, even what we're hearing is still marked by elimination, right? This kind of genocidal impulses. So, it is impossible to speak about the other thing is that you can't, at this present time, talk of neoliberal prosperity, what neoliberalism is doing, without bringing into serious consideration the social cost to massively immiserated families and households, right? The social cost, and this is again important, this social cost includes the rise of vulgar nationalisms, xenophobia, gender violence, generalized violence. My thinking here is that at this political time, where we are most confronted by a historical tension in relation to the surplus population, if we take these populations as purely one of the classes of labor, the argument and so on, the relevance of the reserve army can be, you can only see this surplus population of this reserve army through in relation to the circuits of capitalist production. However, as a class sustained and reproduced through processes of social reproduction that also draw on class, ethnic, gender, racial affinities. This is one of my complaints all the time. We have to talk about these differences because capital, the colonial regime always drew on these differences, right, and articulated them to class. Class cannot be our departure and our beginning and end, right? So the social question that this raises, because even as we're thinking of reproducing these surplus populations under very extreme conditions, these are very immiserated populations. There are these other social questions that we imagine, this kind of nationalisms that are and extreme. So we, when we acknowledge that these processes of social reproduction also, draw on these kinds of differences, caste, the fact that in the global north, if you think of the global migration of nurses from say countries like the Philippines to Canada and the US in the 90s, racialized women have always been put into the circuits of capitalist production on certain conditions. So it's drawing on this racial and gender ethnic affinities and solidarity. The reserve army remain active agents of history, right? Because I'll say this again, you can't, it's not to see this group of their relevance when you think of them as classes in basic. But when you think of these social affinities, right, whether it is the caste or the racial or the gender group, then you understand that they are sustained and reproduced through the group. We've had it here the last couple of days, this kind of very identitarian race. We sometimes are necessary for our struggles. We have to identify as we are this group. We are black, or we are indigenous, or what. That thing is doing something, right? This kind of identification. And so it is that group dynamic that is reproducing these groups of this social relation politically, rather than through the logics of capital per se. In other words, it is ultimately the politicized nature of surplus population that reconstitutes them as legitimate subjects of the state and of the class struggle. The state has to care. The state becomes very scared when you go and say, we as indigenous groups, we as Kingdom are making this thing. The state will not care if you go and say, me, I am a surplus person, I am jobless. They don't care, right? So it is actually these identities that become very active in terms of articulating. And so identitarian politics are problematic. We have to be careful. But we have to deal with them also. We can't ignore them. It is part of how we are governed. When you think of how the colonial state governed on the basis of those fractures, they remain with us. And they remain part of how we express politics. So these are what constitute, I think, the surplus population as legitimate subjects of the state and the class struggle. The very last point, I promise. So in this regard, surplus populations retain the possibilities of reconstituting themselves either as a progressive force or either as a progressive or revolutionary force in the social transformation of society, if they are able to identify with the broader liberation culture. If this is the big question, if on the other hand, the surplus population can actually constitute itself as an entirely reactionary social force. And this we also have to see. If they do not overcome the narrow nationalist constraints that threaten all identitarian groups. All identitarian groups are threatened by by this kind of identitarian movement. So I think if we think of these identity questions and how people reconstitute outside of capital in relation to the state to reproduce, to perform care and social reproduction, then we see that social reproduction becomes a critical lens for understanding the historical constitution of surplus population, because it actually has the capacity, in my view, more than many other of these theoretical interventions. It has the capacity to reveal the social, the cultural, the economic, and the political dimensions of the unfolding crisis. So in a sense, for third world feminists, for people in the global south thinking about this question, the question of care is not, it's always a critique of capitalism. It's always a critique. The fact that we need care and social reproduction is not a positive process, right? It's a domain, it's a profound domain of mass struggle. And so when third world feminists raise the question of care and social reproduction, we are fundamentally also posing the question of innovation. Stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay. My name is Jean, and I'm going to. Oh, can you hear me? Loud?
Yes.
Okay, like that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, I'll try to keep it that way. Okay, so anyway, thank you, Lynn. Anchor. Really enjoyed reading it and then listening to you speak about it. As you know from our conversation, I zoomed into one central place, not because the other points and problems that you raised do not merit our full attention. It's just that this one area caught my eye, mind, heart, and ear, and temporarily made off with them. And in fact, though, it's interesting because what I will go through is, you're answering these questions, you're speaking about the things that I'm just coming at from another angle, but she's answering the question. So I'm going to read you first that place that I zoomed into in your paper. And let me there's one caveat I want to say. Sometimes I might just talk about surplus populations, but rather than saying every single time feminine gendered surplus populations, and I don't think that she says every time, that is what she's speaking of, feminine gendered. And I also want to say that in diaspora contexts, it might be best to say that you're talking about Black feminine gendered surplus populations, or if you're talking about brown feminine gendered surplus populations, you might not have to say that if you are in various places on the African continent. Okay, so here's the place. If the presumption of surplus people as consumers and is constantly threatening to replace an indisciplined labor force does not hold true of the third world labor reserves, the implication is a population that is fundamentally rendered as undesired excess to the needs of capital.
Sorry, Jenny.
It's too fast?
No, too fast for the translation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so let me.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, just to recapitulate
Oh, yes,
your
I
last
will.
paragraph.
Okay, yes, and actually this is Lynn's paragraph.
Oh, sorry.
And I'm reading from the paragraph in this paper that caught my eye and reminded me, because I just can't, I'm not used to practicing this slowly.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. And the translators are wonderful, by the way, because I've been using these.
Yes.
And absolutely fabulous. Okay, so let me try again. If the presumption of surplus people as consumers and is constantly threatening to replace an indisciplined labor force does not hold true for the third world labor reserves, the implication is a population that is fundamentally rendered as an undesired excess to the needs of capital, such that its survival becomes irrelevant to capital or to its functioning. The fact, however, that capital no longer needs this labor does not diminish the fact that these populations still need to survive, or considered in relation to the biopolitics of the sovereign state, still ought to be let to live. Okay, and as such, the economies of socially reproducing them in the absence of adequate wages and state support emerges as one of the most fundamental social problems being produced by capitalist development in the global south today. You'll have to ignore if my head is like off, because I'm like trying to keep rhythm with my head. Like, okay, all right. So that was the thought that caught me. We didn't talk about it. So the thoughts expressed here, I say, bring us to consider. They brought me to consider the relations between undesired excess people in the state. And again, here I'm talking, and again, here I'm talking about feminine gendered undesired excess. Okay. So from their perspective, from mine, and I think that I might safely say that from the perspective of most of the people in this room, they need to survive, but they want to survive and much more than that. They don't simply want to survive. Okay. However, I wonder about the biopolitics of the sovereign state, according to which the state ought to let undesired excess surplus people live. And this is where I do think that Professor Osomo was answering this question, especially towards the end. So I'm going to go on with this thought that even if the state ought to let them live, that does not imply that the state has to do anything for this letting live. This letting live is quite compatible with a letting or allowing to die. Coupled with the fact that the state considers the surplus population as undesired excess, allowing to die would seem to be an expedient and possibly blameless for it to just let them go. Not every state can get away with ethnically cleansing its excess undesired people or genociding them, as has been done successfully in separate colonial states, such as the United States. Not every state can get away with ridding themselves of populations as part of a strategy for achieving their final frontier. So again, it's going to depend on your location, whether or not, whether it's thought you can just allow people to die or not, even with respect to the social reproduction. But allowing to die, letting die, why not? When this may be desirable anyway, since these are undesired people, at least in some contexts. After all, these people are taking up valuable space and territory, transforming it into certain kinds of places or territories through their very presence of their bodies and their being. And if they are essential, as we saw in the world during COVID, here the idea is that they are essential for the kind of social reproduction of keeping each other alive. Is that what the state wants? Again, depending on where you are, for most of them, it might need some of them to be essential for its needs. Does it create an appearance that it should support surplus feminine, gender surplus people? And here the operative term is appearance. I'm thinking about whether the state creates certain appearances such that then various members within the state, I really don't want to use this word citizens, so I'm just saying right now, various members within the state will seek out the state for various things. Sometimes, like I don't, you're heard in the name like that, the woman from the Kilombola, the Russian, as she said, you know, she's not an idiot, she knows when she goes there. She knows what's what, but some other people might think really that the state ought to help you, that this is in the state's interest, not necessarily the state, the first one someone was talking about, but this is part of the state's duty, and that's what they should do. Does the state require or manage to bring about the appearance that it is not or would not be to blame for the death of excess undesired people? Does the state require appearances of supporting surplus people? An appearance that does not match up with reality. If appearances are required, most likely they will be different across states in different geopolitical spaces. Even if the structural realities or some of the structural realities across geopolitical spaces are interconnected and very similar in certain salient respects. It was said during one of the talks, actually this morning, that, quote, we show that we are on the state side in our research. It shows in our grammar, end of quote. Is this in part at least because many in the university actually believe appearances about the role of the state in serving the people that the state in fact slaughters? Academia, the university system, is an arm and agent of the state. I wonder whether it is an appearance in certain spaces that this is not the case. I had to wonder that as I listened in this room this morning. So then, could we laugh together then what Nixon's aide, H.R. Haldeman, wrote in his diary about Nixon's musings on appearance, reality, and Black people. Here's what he wrote. This is Nixon in Haldeman's diary. Got into a deep discussion on welfare, trying to think out the family security decision with Earl Kennedy. The president emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really with Blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. The problem with the overall welfare plan is that it forces poor whites into the same position as Blacks. Feels we have to get rid of the veil of hypocrisy and face reality. Pointed out that there has never in history been an adequate Black nation, and they are the only race of which this is true. It says Africa is homeless, and the worst of it is Liberia, which we built. Okay, so this is Nixon. I love when you have these people, Dan Cullen, he did it in his diary. But he's giving you what actual philosophers love, appearance, reality, distinction. He's telling you you have to have a certain reality which you disguise it in appearance. And that's been going on for quite some time. But we can consider another kind of appearance, and maybe later Ricardo will help us understand this a little bit. This is coming from Steve Biko, and Biko said, if you look at the housing scheme of the nationalists, it's a four-room basis for everybody in a township. The means of transport is bus and train for everyone. So that people participate in the same things, they share so many interests. It's a perfect system for identification, common identification. So what I'm trying to suggest is that there is this constant jarring effect of the system on the people, which makes it possible for quick organization around social issues. Now, whereas if you were working under a progressive party system, then you would get stratification. You might not even know who's Black anymore. Black. Okay, you get stratification creeping in with your masses remaining where they are or getting poorer. And your cream of leadership, which is invariably derived from the so-called educated people, beginning to enter bourgeois ranks, admitted into town, able to vote, developing new attitudes and new frames for their movements. So you get a completely different tone. And this is one country where it would be possible to create a capitalist Black society. If whites were intelligent, he's talking, if the nationalists were intelligent, and that black, capitalist black society, black middle class, would be very effective at an important stage, primarily because a hell of a lot of blacks here have got a bit of education. I'm talking comparatively, speaking to the so-called rest of Africa, and a hell of a lot of them could compete favorably with whites in the fields of industry, commerce, and professions. This is last part that when I was doing my appearance, I think it was very interesting. And South Africa could succeed to put across to the world a pretty convincing, integrated picture with still 70% of the population, black population, being underdogs. So there you get another kind of, you get an idea of an appearance, and there's a reality underneath. And I remember there was a conference, I was online, I think it was during COVID, and you had people speaking from the shack dwellers movement. I don't remember Sue's last name. Yes, maybe. So I asked him about this. You knew that people said this, right? Because now, he's part of the 70%. He said, yes, we knew, but we wanted to believe. We wanted to believe it would be hopeless. We wanted that dream. Maybe even he wanted a rainbow dream, I don't know. Okay, so, going on, perhaps we are living in a moment in which many of us can no longer believe in or pretend that we believe the appearance that the state ought to let excess undesired people populations live, since they murder and incarcerate them so openly while boasting online images of their feet. Again, this will depend on where you are. Okay, might not be talking where this is. But people can use appearances about the role of the state in serving the people as a part of resisting, as a kind of leverage. And I see leverage is going on in what you're talking about. Some resistors may understand the lie of the state's truth, but they might leverage that lie as a belief in appearance against the state that does not want to deal with the huge, visible breach in its appearance reality deception. In some contexts, the state cannot afford this kind of appearance reality gap to open up for the light to see through. But of course, even when resistors are in the know, they may have to use the appearance that the state would support surplus undesired excess people. In so doing, they uphold the very appearance that allows the state to continue managing and manipulating the public. They are, in such a case, what Joy James theorizes as captive returns. That is the satisfied quote from Joy James. A function and service, caretaking, sacrifice, and resistance to dishonor and disposability, which requires or dictates compromises in the moment. One of the compromises a resistor who makes demands to the state for support is serving a function that helps uphold the appearance of the state is there to serve the people they oppress, including undesired excess girls and women, black girls and women. Notwithstanding that the state appears to need a demand to remind them of this fact, but also if the state needs their social reproductive labor, then it may allow them to live there. But this would not be because it ought to live and let them live in any normal moral sense. However, the state presents the appearance that it takes up this moral charge with the right reminder. The concept captive maternal does not denote an identity marker, even if the undesired excess people in question are girls and women. The concept itself is not about gender. So people think it is because it's captive maternal. Okay? This is, I think, an important point, especially as people continue to think that James's concept signals a gendered concept. the conversation, Professor Osomo gave me a distinction between your work analyzing feminist histories of Black women and your work as a political theorist. I think that this distinction can help us to think about how theorists might approach the captive maternal as a concept denoting an ungendered function while focusing on people gendered as girls and women who satisfy the function. So, we're getting ready to end now. Unless I misunderstood you, you are not moved by the appearance. You know that the state would be overjoyed to let die when it comes to surplus, undesired, excess people. However, you understand that there was reason for using the language you wrote would suggest that proposing that surplus, undesired people must be, in certain contexts, considered in relation to the biopolitics of a sovereign state, where such consideration proposes that they ought to be. So perhaps you could lead us all into a discussion of some of these matters amongst all of the very important issues you raised, perhaps especially now. Obrigada. Sorry about my phone, but I can't turn it off because it has a problem. When I turned it off, something was happening to it.
We put it here.
Pessoal, a Aline pediu para responder a Janine e depois a gente encerrar, se não tiver perguntas. Pode ser?
Não sei se tem tempo. É melhor ela responder. E aí, se tiver tempo, a gente faz pergunta.
Thanks, Julie. This is very helpful. Comment, very long comment, but all comment. I think it's a legitimate question. Definitely what you're asking, especially as an interested in about whether it is that the state creates such appearances. I think what I'm thinking of truly is around the possibility of social organizing. I mean, I just cannot live and think in a world where there's a population that will say that there's no possibility. There has to be a possibility. Because we move away from cynicism. And I think fundamentally I'm asserting that there's a political basis. It might not be an economic one, because everything tells us it's very hard to draw up an economic relation between this surplus population, capital, and the state. I think there's certainly a political relation, which means that they are much more than expendable labor, right? The other thing is that democracy has never not needed these bodies. Joy James's work on journals, where she thinks of this population, captive maternals, and which cannot be collapsed. They're certainly not, some of the suburbs can be captive, but not all. As the very basis of Western democracy, right? This is, and it remains so. Think of Spillers, when Spillers said, she's talking again of captive, and she's appropriating the voice of this enslaved woman who says that if I did not exist, the state would infect me, right? So in a sense, I think the point I'm trying to make through and through is the state actually presumes that gender substratum. But, you know, I think it's been so successful in, you know, slavery was successful. You know, we know it through the writings of enslaved black women, that there was this group, there was this structure that absolutely made it possible. Right? And what it did to black families, and what it did to gender itself, how it ungendered them, how it emasculated, you know, we know that. We know this of the colonial state, that there's no way the capitalist accumulation project of the colonial state would have succeeded. We have become so primed in this current moment to denying it, we stop seeing it. What is unfair? I think that's my answer. Because it is absolutely, it's even worse now. You know, COVID was such a vindication for those who will talk about this question of social reproduction and care, because for the first time we saw it on a global scale, that without that economy of care, those economies of care, it would have stood still, right? Wages were out of the equation for many people. There's a photo I saw in the Kenyan daily newspapers that really struck me and kind of really put into relief this argument I've been trying to make in relation to the agrarian economy. This was during hard lockdown, and there was a photo of public buses that usually transport people from the cities, right? And this bus was coming from, these buses were moving from the rural areas to the main urban areas, Nairobi, Kisumu, and Mombasa. Those buses were full of food. And they were not food for sale. They were food that rural families were sending to their urban families who are no longer working, who are no longer earning an income. So, getting back to Ricardo's talk yesterday on this articulation between the rural and urban, and also urban agriculture. You know, so this kind of reproductive relation is absolutely assumed, but you know, it was an interesting photo, but it's quite unremarked. You know, the paper was in the front, the side of the paper. But finally, it said, we are not dreaming these things. And so my concern is really that. It is that, yes, the state might want to create certain appearances, but I think politically, there's no state that can actually govern when 70%, as I mentioned in South Africa, of this population has no access to food. And the state might not provide that directly. It is provided through this other economy that is actually organized in very interesting ways through these groups, these social groups are very important. So those social groups are also very important in how the state manages these kinds of reproductive economy. But I think, and then one of the ways it can manage it is actually to produce the conditions for fascist tensions, right? Brazil has certainly seen its own share of that. India, much of Western Europe is seeing this. We have to deal with what is happening is that this tension that emerged from this identitarian groups is part of how the state stabilizes its own. But if there are groups that are saying we have to survive, you don't care about what is happening to you migrants, you other groups, we have to survive. In turn to that group, there is a social organizing that we have to pay attention to, because the state is also not providing for that group that is fighting to survive. Anyway, we without kind of bastardizing it or kind of seeing it everywhere, my argument is really that there is a basis, there is a historical basis, but there is certainly a social and political basis to think about how the state produces itself in relation to capital under very extremely miserating times and conditions. How are the states doing it? You know, when they should be existing. You know, if it wasn't for that, then we can just keep producing itself with one itself. You know, I think these are longer discussions. I don't think these are things considering. But I hope that we can think in our own realizations of development, of social struggles around this question of social reproduction, which I think is one of the fundamental questions of our time.
I was just really, yes, I wanted to say briefly, yes, I think this is where it really becomes important, even if you say global south, to look at your locale. I'm not sure that the state of Israel thinks it needs any excess surplus Palestinians. In fact, they are all, whether they are in the West Bank or they're in Gaza, they are all excess. If you look at the United States, I'm not sure that the United States thinks or thought that it needed the feminine gendered indigenous people once they dispossess them of their land. So, yeah, I really think it depends on place. And I also think that one other thing, I'm not sure that there are any democracies. In fact, I certainly don't live in one. Okay, so I would be hard pressed to say what they are, where the so-called democracies are. If you're talking about a restricted type of representation of a very select group, maybe property white men, maybe property white men and women. I was telling Professor Ossom the other day, there's a book maybe you would be interested to read it called They Were Her Property, about the white women in the United States that owned Black enslaved people, and they had rights, they could go to court, they were left this property, usually by their fathers, their mothers, their parents. So I'm not in disagreement with what you're saying. I think one really has to look at the site, the locale, and the time, and what kind of is something to think about the moment we're in, what we're seeing, what the possibilities of genocide without any response from there are responses. There are responses from the West. Basically, go ahead and how can we help? How can we help fuel this? How can we help give you weapons? I think we have to also watch, even in the places that you're speaking of, how this evolves. How this evolves, especially with also technology coming in certain ways. So that is all I'm going to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just say something? For the question of Palestine, I mean, Israel is doing precisely. Israel as a state has placed the conditions of the survival of its own people on. It has always needed that land.
It's on the land.
Yes.
On freedoms.
Exactly. So as a state, it's conforming to this very logical.
But it doesn't need to let them live. It doesn't need to let them.
It is genocidal. As I was talking about project, this, if we think about this question of reproduction in the economies, in different parts, it has been genocidal. It can't be it can't have the logic of elimination. But when we think, and I think I'm thinking, it's hard to make these arguments if you're not conceptually clear on the image that we're analyzing of the state itself and its logic and its political logics. And on that basis, it is absolutely clear that Israel, the conditions for its survival of its people, of reproducing its people depends on that.
But it doesn't depend. To me, this is a very important point.
Mike.
Oh, I can speak loudly.
No, it's the translator.
Oh, I'm sorry. Depending on the death of Palestinians and the dispossession of their land is a very different proposition to me than saying it's premised on letting or allowing them to live or even enabling to live because of the kind of social reproduction that they're involved in. To me, that's just very different. Yes, it is premised on the unfreedom in all forms, but the ultimate form is they don't exist anymore. And maybe, I don't know, but I'm not able to see that as the same thing as, well, it's premised on their land. Yes, I know that.
Well,
Yes, I know that.
things are huge. It might not be allowed to live on its land or in the form that constitutes it as a nation and as a civilization, but it will exist because the very reason for your existence as a state is against a threat, upon a threat that you have defined as political. And that threat has to remain in existence somehow, whether it is diaspora or whether it is anyway. But on the issue of the democracy, I'm certainly not talking about some idealized form of democracy. I'm talking about the actually existing form, which is the liberal kind of iteration of it. We never had a perfect democracy anywhere. I think we can't let go of, I like the idea of democracy. It doesn't belong to modernity, it doesn't belong to enlightenment, I think it belongs to all of us. I want to hold it, but we have to critique it thoroughly from inside. We can't critique it from an idealized position.
But actually, I'm actually thinking this is
Sorry, Chinese.
even when I think of very, well, he's not conservative, but if you think of someone like Professor, I cannot say his name, Professor Mearsheimer in Chicago. He gives in his books criteria for democracy. I would love to meet him. But I would like to say, where do you think this exists? Where do you think this criteria is satisfied? So I'm not thinking, he's not thinking of something idealized. He actually sees himself as a realist. I don't think that the criteria he sets for are realized in the actual world. So therefore, I am not interested in an idealized. I'm the one who say, no, there might be an idealized democracy, but there certainly isn't an actual. But I'm not trying to take away an idea that, I don't want to take that away from people, but I don't think it actually exists.
Pessoal, muito obrigado. Acho que foi um dia proveitoso. Amanhã a gente retorna às 10 com a palestra de encerramento da
10.
10.
9h30, chega em